My name is Willow and I'm 32 years old. For most of my adult life, my family has seen me as the eccentric one, the weirdo, the paranoid hermit stockpiling beans and batteries in my little house at the edge of the suburbs. They called it my hobby, a word they'd use with a condescending little laugh, as if I were collecting stamps or building ships in a bottle. They never imagined that one day my hobby would be the only thing standing between them and the end of the world as they knew it. They never thought they'd show up on my doorstep, terrified and broken, begging for the very things they mocked. I took them in, but I knew in my heart this wasn't just about survival. This was about rewriting every rule they had ever lived by. Before I dive into the story of how the lights went out and I had to teach my family how to live again, I want to hear from you. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated or had your passions dismissed by the people who were supposed to support you, go ahead and hit that like button. And for all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe to join our community of people who understand that sometimes the ones who seem the most out of step are actually the ones who are the most prepared for the road ahead. The last time I saw them before the world changed was for my father's 65th birthday dinner. It was at their sprawling house, the one with the perfectly manicured lawn and the 3-car garage that housed my brother's Tesla and my sister's immaculate SUV. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and the even thicker scent of their polite, suffocating judgment. My father, David, a retired engineer who believed in logic and numbers above all else, surveyed the table with a practiced air of patriarchal contentment. My mother, Susan, fluttered around, refilling wine glasses and ensuring everyone's comfort, her anxiety a low hum just beneath the surface of her perfect hostess smile. My brother, Mark, sat opposite me. He was the golden child, a successful wealth manager who spoke about the stock market like it was a religion and looked at my calloused hands with a kind of pitying disgust. Next to him was my sister, Chloe, a lifestyle blogger whose entire existence seemed to be curated for Instagram. She was documenting the dinner, of course, taking artfully angled photos of the food. Her phone's camera flashed a tiny, intermittent spotlight of her priorities. The conversation, as it always did, eventually turned to me. It started with my mother. "Willow, honey," she began, her voice laced with that familiar, weary concern. "Your father and I were just saying, it's been a while since you've taken a real vacation. You worked so hard on that garden of yours. I knew what was coming. It was a well-worn script. My garden is fine, Mom. And I like being home," I said, keeping my voice even. Mark snorted, a little puff of air that was more dismissive than any word could be. "You mean you like hiding in your bunker," he said, not even looking at me, instead swirling the red wine in his glass. "Dad, did you hear? Willow bought another doomsday toy. What was it this time, Will?" A hand-cranked radio to listen for alien signals. The jab was meant to get a laugh, and it did. Chloe giggled, a tinkling sound that set my teeth on edge. "Oh, Mark, be nice," she said, though her eyes were sparkling with amusement. "It's probably for her podcast, Tales from the Tinfoil Hat." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I had recently purchased a high-end shortwave radio, one capable of picking up signals from around the globe without relying on the internet or local infrastructure. It had cost a significant amount of money I had earned through my small but successful business selling organic seeds and homemade preserves at the farmer's market. "It's for emergency communications," I stated, my voice tighter than I wanted. "If the grid goes down, it's one of the only ways to get information." My father sighed, setting his fork down with a clatter. This was his cue to step in with his brand of logical, paternalistic condescension. "Willow, let's be realistic. The American power grid is one of the most robust systems in the world. The redundancies have redundancies. The scenario you're preparing for, this total collapse, it's a fantasy. It's statistically infinitesimal." "It's not a fantasy," I countered, looking him directly in the eye. "Carrington Event, 1859. A solar flare knocked out the entire telegraph system across North America and Europe. If that happened today, it would fry every unprotected transformer. We'd be sent back to the 1800s in an instant." He waved a dismissive hand. A historical anomaly. We have safeguards now. Satellites that watch the sun. Protocols. You watch too many movies. And you watch too much cable news, I muttered under my breath. What was that? He asked sharply. Nothing, I said, pushing a piece of potato around my plate. Chloe, ever the peacemaker when it suited her, chimed in. Well, I just think all that money could be spent on something more fun. Like a trip to Bali. Or at least a new wardrobe. Those work boots are hardly chic, Willow. She gestured to my feet under the table. I was wearing my sturdy, comfortable boots because I'd come straight from reinforcing the fence around my chicken coop. It was a detail I hadn't thought to hide, a detail that marked me, in their eyes, as something wild and unkempt. My boots are practical, I said simply. Everything with you is practical, Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. It's just a weird way to live, sis. Constantly expecting the worst. Life is meant to be enjoyed. You should be investing in your 401k, not in MREs. I didn't have a 401k. I had a root cellar. I had solar panels. I had a deep well with a manual pump option. I had knowledge, skills that my grandfather, a man who had survived the Great Depression, had drilled into me as a child. He taught me to garden, to can, to mend, to identify edible plants in the woods. He used to say the world is one bad day away from forgetting how to feed itself. Don't you ever forget. My family saw it as trauma he'd passed down. I saw it as wisdom. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of similar small cuts. They weren't malicious, not really. They were just so insulated by their comfortable world, so certain of its permanence, that my lifestyle seemed like a form of madness. It was an indictment of their own choices, and they couldn't stand it. As I drove home that night, the city lights blazing around me, I didn't feel angry. I just felt a profound and weary loneliness. I was speaking a language they refused to understand. Little did any of us know they were about to need a translator, and fast. It happened 10 days later, on a Tuesday. The day started with a strange beauty. The sky, even in the mid-morning, had an ethereal, shimmering quality. Hues of pink and green, usually reserved for the most remote northern latitudes, were painting the edges of the clouds. On the news, they were calling it a once-in-a-lifetime solar storm, a beautiful and harmless light show. Scientists were giddy. Chloe was probably outside, trying to get the perfect shot for her blog. I knew better. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just a light show. This was a warning. I spent the morning going through my final checklist, a low thrum of adrenaline in my veins. I topped off the water barrels from my well pump, even though they were already 90% full. I checked the charge on my battery bank, a wall of deep cycle marine batteries connected to the solar panels on my roof. They were at 100%. I did a quick inventory of my root cellar. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and shelves upon shelves of glass jars, their contents gleaming like jewels, green beans, peaches, tomato sauce, pickled beets. A library of summer days, preserved against the coming winter. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. He had been a quiet, stoic man, and his stories were not meant to scare me, but to inoculate me against the kind of blissful ignorance my parents had adopted. He told me about the Dust Bowl, about neighbors who had everything one day and nothing the next. He'd lived through a time when the systems people trusted had utterly failed them. He believed the only real security was in the land, in your hands, and in your head. I had taken his lessons to heart, building my entire life around them. My family called it paranoia. Grandpa called it prudence. I remembered one specific summer when I was 12. A fierce thunderstorm had knocked out the power in our suburban neighborhood for 3 days. While my parents fretted about the food spoiling in the freezer and Mark complained about his video games not working, Grandpa and I had sat on the back porch. He taught me how to make a simple camp stove from a coffee can and how to cook a meal on it. He showed me which of the weeds in the backyard were actually edible dandelions and plantain. While my family felt helpless and inconvenienced, I had felt powerful. It was the first time I understood that preparedness wasn't about fear. It was about freedom. It was the freedom from being a victim of circumstance. That feeling had become the bedrock of my life, the foundation upon which I had built my little fortress of self-reliance. At 2:17 p.m., the world ended. It wasn't a bang. It was a hum. A low, pervasive, electronic hum that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds. And then silence. A profound, absolute silence that was more terrifying than any noise. The gentle whir of the refrigerator in my kitchen died. The digital clock on the microwave vanished. I looked out the window. The traffic light at the end of my street was dark. A car coasting through the intersection suddenly lost all power and rolled to a silent stop. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it was a drumbeat of readiness, not panic. This was it. The thing I had spent my life preparing for. I walked over to my main circuit breaker and flipped it off, disconnecting my house from the now dead city grid. A critical step. When or if the power ever came back, the initial surge could fry every appliance in the house. Then, I went to the basement and engaged the inverter system. With a soft click and a gentle hum, the power came back on. Not the city's power, but mine. The lights flickered on, powered by the sun and the batteries. The refrigerator started its quiet whirring again. My well pump was active. I was an island of light and life in a dead sea. The first 24 hours were a surreal mix of calm efficiency and a dawning, horrifying awareness of the scale of the event. I went through my protocols. I drew the heavy blackout curtains over every window, a simple step to avoid drawing unwanted attention. A house with lights on in a world of darkness was a beacon, and not necessarily for friends. I cooked a simple, hearty meal of potato soup on my stove, the familiar actions a comfort in the unnerving quiet. The silence was the strangest part. No distant traffic, no airplanes overhead, no hum of electronics from the neighbors' houses. The sounds of modern civilization had been erased. I switched on my shortwave radio, the one Mark had mocked. Cranking the handle to power it, I scanned the frequencies. Mostly static. But then, a faint, panicked voice from a station hundreds of miles away, confirming a massive coronal mass ejection, widespread grid failure. Reports are coming in from all over. Europe, Asia, it seems to be global. The voice crackled and then was lost to a wave of static. Global. The word hung in the air of my small kitchen. My father, with all his faith in safeguards and redundancies, had been wrong. So catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. A part of me, a small, ugly part, felt a surge of grim vindication. But it was quickly replaced by a cold dread. My family was out there in that silent, dark world. They were completely, utterly unprepared. For 2 days, I existed in my bubble of normality. I tended my garden, fed my chickens, and read a book by the light of a solar-charged lamp. I reinforced a section of my fence and split a pile of firewood. The routine was my anchor. But I couldn't ignore the world outside my door. I saw people walking down the middle of the street, their faces etched with confusion and fear. I heard arguments break out. Neighbors who were once friendly now yelling at each other over a bottle of water or a can of gasoline. The thin veneer of civilization was peeling away, and it was happening faster than even I had imagined. I thought of my family. I pictured their house, filled with smart devices that were now just plastic bricks. Their refrigerator, full of expensive organic food, was now a stinking coffin of rot. Their electric cars were useless statues in the garage. They had no stored water beyond a few cases of Pellegrino Chloe, probably had for entertaining. They had no way to cook, no source of light beyond decorative candles, no way to stay warm if the nights got cold. They had nothing but the rapidly diminishing currency of their former lives. I felt a pang of something, not pity, exactly, but a deep, aching sorrow for their helplessness. They were like children left alone in the dark. On the third day, they came. I was in the kitchen, washing vegetables from the garden, when I heard the sound. A desperate, frantic knocking on my front door. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor. It was the sound of pure desperation. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the wood stove, my hand gripping it tightly, and moved silently to the front window. Peeking through the edge of the blackout curtain, I saw them. It was my whole family, huddled together on my porch like refugees. They were a pathetic sight. My father's expensive suit was wrinkled and stained, his face pale and stubbled. My mother was weeping silently, her hands twisting a useless silk scarf. Chloe looked like a ghost of her former self, her perfect hair a mess, her trendy clothes smudged with dirt, her face stripped of all its artifice and filled with a raw, animal fear. And Mark, my proud, arrogant brother, looked broken. His shoulders were slumped, his face was a mask of defeat, and he was holding his 5-year-old son, Leo, who was wrapped in a blanket. They had walked the 7 miles from their house to mine. I stood there for a long moment, the poker heavy in my hand, my heart a raging battleground of emotions. There was the satisfaction, cold and sharp, of being proven right. There was the anger, a simmering resentment for all the years of mockery. But beneath it all, there was something else. They were my family, and they were in trouble. Taking a deep breath, I put the poker down, unbolted the 3 locks on my door, and opened it. The sight of me, standing there in the light, clean and calm, seemed to stun them into silence. They stared at me as if I were an apparition. My father was the first to speak, his voice raspy. "Willow, thank God. The power, everything's gone." "I know," I said, my voice flat. We have nothing," my mother whispered, her voice choked with tears. "The water stopped. The food is all spoiled. We're so scared." Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the ground, clutching his son tighter. It was Chloe who finally broke the dam of their pride. She took a stumbling step forward, her hands outstretched in a plea. "Please, Willow. Can we please come in? We don't know what to do. You were right. You were right about everything." Her words, the ones I had fantasized about hearing for years, didn't bring the triumph I expected. They just sounded hollow and desperate. I looked at their faces, stripped of all their superiority, and saw only fear. I looked at my little nephew, Leo, his face pale and his eyes huge in the dim light. My decision was already made. It had been made the moment I saw them on my porch. But it wasn't going to be that simple. I stepped back, holding the door open. "Get inside," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "All of you." Now, as they shuffled past me into the warmth and light of my home, a chaotic mix of relief and shame on their faces, I closed the door and slid the bolts back into place. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the house. They were safe from the world outside, but they had just entered a new one, and it operated on a completely different set of rules. My rules. I let them sit in the living room for a few minutes, a silent, huddled mass on my simple, practical furniture. They looked around at the warm, lit room, the scent of wood smoke in the air, with a kind of dazed wonder. It was like they had stepped from a nightmare into a dream. My mother kept touching the rough wool of the blanket on the sofa, as if to confirm it was real. Mark had set Leo down, and the little boy was staring at a lit lamp, as if it were magic. I went to the kitchen and returned with 5 glasses of water, cool and clear, drawn from my well just moments before. I handed one to each of them. My father drank his in 3 long gulps, then looked at the empty glass in his hand with something like reverence. "I never thought," he said, his voice hoarse, "I would ever be this grateful for a glass of water." I let that hang in the air for a moment before I spoke. "That's the first lesson," I said, my voice calm and steady. They all looked at me. Never take a glass of water for granted. I pulled over the small whiteboard I use for garden planning and set it in front of them. The commander in me, the part that had planned and drilled and prepared for this exact moment, took over. There would be time for emotions later. Now was for logistics. Now was for survival. "I'm glad you're all here, and I'm glad you're safe," I began, picking up a dry erase marker. "But you need to understand something right now. This is not your house. This is not a vacation home or a hotel. This is a lifeboat. It has one captain, and it has a finite amount of resources. To stay on this boat, everyone rows. There are no passengers. Is that clear?" They all nodded, their eyes wide and fixed on me. The shift in power was so absolute, so total, that it was almost dizzying. A week ago, they were patronizing me over dinner. Now, I was their sole authority on existence. "Good," I said, and I started to write on the board. "Rule 1, water. Every drop is precious. We have a well, but the pump requires energy. We ration. No long showers. No running the tap. All washing is done with basins. All gray water is saved for the garden. I looked at Chloe, whose expression was already one of horror. Chloe, your half-hour showers are a thing of the past. You get 5 minutes, same as everyone else. She opened her mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it and shut it with a click. Rule 2, food. I continued, writing on the board. We have enough to last a long time if we are smart. But only if we are smart. We eat what I cook when I cook it. There is no snacking. There are no special requests. We eat to live, not for pleasure. The garden and the chickens are now our lifeline. They will be tended to daily. Rule 3, chores. I started a list on the board. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, perimeter checks, system maintenance, cooking, cleaning. These are not optional. They will be assigned on a rotating basis. If you don't work, you don't eat. It's that simple. Mark, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, a flicker of his old self returning. Willow, this is a bit much. We're your family, not your boot camp recruits. Perhaps I could manage the logistics. I'm good with spreadsheets. I can create a resource allocation matrix. I stopped writing and turned to face him, my expression unyielding. Mark, your spreadsheets are worthless here. Your stock portfolio is toilet paper. The only resource allocation that matters is the one in my head, because I am the only one who knows the systems. You want to contribute? You can learn to use an axe. Tomorrow, you're on wood chopping duty. The look on his face was a mixture of shock and indignation. He, Mark, the man who paid a service to mow his lawn and another to clean his gutters, was being assigned to chop wood. It was unthinkable. My father tried a different tack, his voice taking on a placating, paternal tone. Willow, darling, we understand you're in charge, but you have to see this from our perspective. We're in shock. We're not equipped for this kind of thing. I know, I said, my voice softening slightly, but losing none of its firmness. That's why Rule 4 is the most important one. I wrote it on the board in large letters. Rule 4, everyone learns. You are not just going to do chores. You're going to learn why they are done. You're going to learn how to purify water, how to identify edible plants, how to start a fire without a match, how to handle a weapon for defense, and how to perform basic first aid. I am not your permanent savior. I am your teacher. Because if something happens to me, you need to be able to save yourselves. That silenced them. The gravity of those words sank in, chasing away the last vestiges of their old world arrogance. The idea that my continued existence was the only thing keeping them alive was a terrifyingly new concept for them. So, I said, capping the marker, that's the new world order. Any questions? There were none. Just the quiet, stunned silence of 5 people realizing their lives had been irrevocably and completely upended. The first few days were a crucible of frustration and failure. It was one thing to hear the rules. It was another to live them. Chloe was assigned to work with me in the garden, and it was a disaster. She complained about the dirt under her fingernails, recoiled from the earthworms, and asked if there were any gloves that didn't feel so scratchy. There is no scratchy, Chloe, I told her, my patience already wearing thin as I showed her how to properly weed a bed of carrots. There is only effective and ineffective. These gloves are effective. She sighed dramatically. It's just my hands. They're my brand. I have a sponsorship with a hand cream company. Or, I did. The realization that her old life, her brand, was gone seemed to hit her in waves, each one leaving her more adrift. Mark's first day on wood chopping duty was even more of a spectacle. He approached the woodpile with the confidence of a CEO entering a boardroom, picked up the axe, and swung it with all the grace of a toddler. The axe head bounced off the log with a dull thud, barely making a dent, and the force of the rebound almost wrenched the handle from his hands. He stumbled back, his face flushing with embarrassment. You're trying to muscle it, I said, walking over from the garden. You have to read the wood. See the grain? Aim for the existing cracks. Let the weight of the axe do the work. I took the axe from him. It felt balanced and familiar in my hands. I selected a log, positioned it, and with a single fluid motion, brought the axe down. It split with a satisfying crack, the two halves falling neatly to the sides. Mark stared at the split log, then at me, then at his own soft, blister-free hands. How did you? Practice, I said, handing the axe back to him. Years of it. Your turn. He spent the rest of the morning swinging and swearing, his form clumsy, his progress agonizingly slow. By lunchtime, he had managed to split a handful of logs and had earned a painful-looking blister on his palm. He came into the house defeated, his expensive polo shirt soaked with sweat. He didn't complain, though. He just sat at the table, staring at his hands, the first glimmer of humility dawning in his eyes. My parents were a different challenge. My father, the engineer, resisted my methods on an intellectual level. When I was showing him how to operate the simple hand pump for the well, he kept trying to optimize it. You know, Willow, he said, examining the mechanism, if we were to recalibrate the fulcrum and add a counterweight system, we could increase the efficiency by at least 15%. Dad, I said, stopping his tinkering, it's not a theoretical problem. It's a pump. It works. We don't have the tools or the time to recalibrate it. We just need water. Please, just learn how it works as it is. He huffed, clearly annoyed that his expertise was being dismissed, but he complied. He was a man used to being the smartest person in the room, and he was struggling to adapt to a world where his knowledge was suddenly obsolete. My mother, Susan, was the most adaptable, but also the most broken. Her anxiety, once a low hum, was now a constant, silent scream in her eyes. She was terrified of everything, the silence, the darkness outside, the responsibility. She followed me around like a lost child, her hands fluttering nervously. My first instinct was to shield her, but I knew that would be a mistake. She needed purpose. I decided to put her in charge of the kitchen. Not just cooking, but the whole system of food preservation that would be critical in the coming months. I took her down to the root cellar, a place she had only ever glanced at with a kind of morbid curiosity. Now, seeing the shelves laden with jars, her eyes widened. You did all this, she whispered, running a hand over a jar of peaches. Grandma taught me the basics, I said. I taught myself the rest. I started with something simple, showing her how to preserve the remaining herbs from the garden by drying them. It was a delicate, methodical task, one that required focus. As she sat at the kitchen table, carefully tying bunches of thyme and rosemary to hang from the rafters, I saw a flicker of her old self return. Her hands, usually fluttering with anxiety, were steady. Her focus was absolute. She was creating something, contributing. It was the first time since she had arrived that I saw a genuine, non-terrified expression on her face. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As the days turned into a week, a tense routine began to form. They were learning, slowly and painfully. Chloe discovered a surprising patience for dealing with the chickens, and the day she collected her first egg, she held it up with a look of triumph that was more real than any of her 1,000-like Instagram posts. Mark, his hands now calloused and tough, became proficient with the axe, and the neat stacks of firewood growing against the side of the house were a testament to his labor. He spoke less and listened more. My father, having accepted the limits of his theoretical knowledge, focused on learning the practical skills I taught him, applying his engineer's mind to mastering the systems of the house. But the world outside my fence was a constant, grim reminder of our precarious situation. The initial confusion in the neighborhood had curdled into desperation. We'd hear shouting at night, sometimes followed by the sound of breaking glass. People were getting hungry, and they were getting reckless. The first direct threat came a week and a half in. It was late afternoon, and I was on my designated perimeter check, walking the fence line. Mark was with me. I was teaching him what to look for. Breaks in the fence, tracks, signs of anyone watching the house. That's when we saw him. Mr. Henderson from 3 houses down. He was a friendly man, a retiree who always had a cheerful wave for everyone. Now he looked thin and haggard, his eyes wild with a desperation that made my blood run cold. He was trying to pry the boards off his own neighbor's window, his movements clumsy and loud. He hadn't seen us. We should do something, Mark whispered, his instinct for order and civility kicking in. Stay quiet, I hissed, pulling him back behind a thicket of bushes. We watched as the neighbor, a large man named Blevins, burst out of his front door, screaming. He was holding a baseball bat. Henderson scrambled back, pleading, but Blevins wasn't listening. He swung the bat, and Henderson fell to the ground. Blevins stood over him, yelling threats before going back inside and slamming the door. Mark was pale, his breathing shallow. My God, Blevins was going to kill him. Over what? A can of soup? Probably, I said grimly. That's where we are now. Welcome to the new world, Mark. We waited until Blevins was back inside and Henderson had staggered away before we continued our patrol, the silence between us heavy. The incident had shaken Mark to his core. His belief in the inherent goodness of his neighbors, in the fundamental rules of society, had just been shattered. That night, a new knock came at the door. It wasn't my family this time. It was a young couple from the next street over, a man and a woman, holding a small baby. They looked exhausted and terrified. Please, the woman begged through the door, her voice cracking. We saw your light. We have a baby. She hasn't had clean water in 2 days. We don't need food, just a little water. My entire family froze in the living room, looking at me. Their faces were a canvas of conflicting emotions. Pity, fear, a dawning understanding of my strict rules. Chloe looked like she was about to cry. Even Mark's newfound pragmatism was being tested. This wasn't an aggressive neighbor like Blevins. This was a family just like us. I felt a pang of deep compassion, but it was overridden by a cold, hard logic. My well was my most critical resource. My house was a secret that needed to be kept. If I helped them, word would spread. The light they had seen was a mistake, a flicker through a curtain I hadn't secured properly. My haven could quickly become a target. I went to the door, but I didn't open it. I can't let you in, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. It wouldn't be safe for any of us. Please, the man's voice pleaded. We're desperate. I can help you, I said through the door. But not by opening this door. Listen to me carefully. Head east, towards the old quarry. There's a spring on the north face, about halfway up. The water runs clean. It's your best chance. Take it, and don't tell anyone where you're going or who told you. I went to the kitchen, filled a 2-liter bottle with water from my tap, and grabbed a small bag with some water purification tablets and a high-protein energy bar. I opened the door just a crack. My foot braced against it and passed the supplies out. This is all I can give you. It's to get you to the quarry. Now go, and don't come back. The woman took the bottle, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disappointment. Thank you, she whispered. They turned and disappeared into the darkness. I closed and bolted the door, my heart pounding. When I turned back to my family, they were all staring at me. Chloe's face was a mask of horrified disbelief. How could you do that? She whispered. They had a baby, Willow. You just sent them away. I saved them, Chloe, I countered, my voice sharp. I gave them a resource they can use long term, not a handout that would last a day. And I protected us. If I let them in, how long until their friends show up? Or their enemies? How long until someone like Blevins decides he wants our well all to himself and comes with more than just a baseball bat? We are on an island. We can't take on the whole ocean. Mark, to my surprise, spoke up. She's right, Chloe, he said quietly, looking at his son Leo, who was asleep on the couch. It's harsh, but she's right. We can't save everyone. We can barely save ourselves. Chloe just shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and fled to the room I had given her. A new rift had opened in the family, not between them and me, but between the old world's morality and the new world's brutal necessities. We had light. We had water. We had food. But we were learning that survival came at a cost, and the price was a piece of the people we used to be. The delicate ecosystem of our survival was thrown into chaos 3 weeks in. The days had grown colder and a persistent, dreary rain had set in, turning the world outside into a muddy, gray landscape. The initial shock had worn off for my family, replaced by a grim, monotonous routine. But routine breeds complacency. It was Leo, Mark's son. He was a good kid, quiet and observant, but he was still just a 5-year-old, bored and cooped up in the house. While Chloe was distracted trying to mend a tear in his pants, he had slipped outside into the backyard. He had been watching Mark and me test the rainwater we collected in the barrels, a system I was still perfecting to supplement the well. I had explicitly told everyone that the water in the barrels was not yet safe to drink. It needed to be filtered and boiled first. But to a thirsty child, water is water. He cupped his hands and took a few gulps from the downspout. No one knew until the next morning. He woke up flushed and crying, his small body racked with fever. My mother, who was the first to check on him, let out a sharp cry of alarm that brought us all running. Leo was burning up. His breathing was shallow, and he was delirious, muttering nonsense. Panic, cold and absolute, seized the house. It was a raw, primal fear that I hadn't seen in them before. This wasn't about comfort or pride. This was about the life of a child. What do we do? Chloe wailed, her hands twisting in her hair. We have to call a doctor. An ambulance. There are no doctors, Chloe, Mark said, his voice trembling as he felt his son's forehead. There's number 911. There's nothing. He looked up at me, his face a mess of terror and desperation. All the progress he had made, all his newfound competence, dissolved in an instant. He was just a terrified father. Willow, please, you have to do something. The entire family turned to me, their eyes pleading. In that moment, I wasn't their weird sister or their bossy taskmaster. I was their last and only hope. The weight of it was immense, a physical pressure on my chest. I took a deep breath, pushing down my own fear. This was the test, not just for me, but for everything I had built, everything I believed in. Bring him to the living room, I ordered, my voice sharp and clear, cutting through their panic. Lay him on the sofa. Susan, give me a basin of cool water and some cloths. David, you're on fire duty. I need a steady, low fire in the stove, and I need a kettle of water boiled immediately. Mark, Chloe, you stay with him. Talk to him. Keep him calm. They scattered, grateful for the direction, for tasks to perform. The panic in the room subsided, replaced by a tense, focused energy. I went to my own personal apothecary, a set of shelves in my pantry that was my most prized possession after my books. It was filled with dozens of glass jars containing dried herbs, tinctures, and salves. This was the knowledge my family had dismissed as witchcraft and hocus pocus. Now it was all we had. I knew the symptoms. High fever, stomach distress, delirium. It was almost certainly a bacterial infection from the untreated rainwater. A modern doctor would have prescribed a powerful antibiotic. I had to rely on the pharmacy of the earth. My hands moved with practiced certainty. I pulled down jars of yarrow, the classic herb for breaking a fever by inducing sweat. I took out echinacea and golden seal, nature's powerful antibiotics, to fight the infection itself. I found dried willow bark, the original source of aspirin, for the pain and fever. My mind was a flurry of calculations, dosages, preparations, timings. Back in the living room, I saw Mark trying to use his dead smartphone, swiping at the blank screen out of sheer, pathetic habit, looking for an answer the old world could no longer provide. The gesture was so futile, so heartbreaking, that it solidified my resolve. He doesn't need a search engine, Mark, I said, my voice softer than I intended. He needs this. I set to work. I crushed the willow bark and yarrow, steeping them in the hot water my father brought. The earthy, bitter scent filled the room. Susan, I said to my mother, who was hovering uselessly, her face pale with fear. I need your help. I need you to grind these. I handed her a mortar and pestle and the tough, woody roots of the echinacea. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. She took the tools and began to work, her hands moving with a desperate, rhythmic force. We worked side by side, a silent, focused team. I showed her how to mix the ground herbs with honey to make them palatable for a child. I created a poultice of crushed plantain leaves, a natural anti-inflammatory, to place on his hot forehead. The hours bled together into a long, terrifying vigil. We took turns forcing small spoonfuls of the herbal tea into Leo, bathing his small body with cool cloths. The house was silent except for the crackle of the fire, Leo's shallow breaths, and the soft sound of my mother and me working. The rest of the family watched, helpless. They saw me not as Willow the paranoid prepper, but as someone else entirely, a healer, a scientist, a shaman. They were watching a kind of magic they didn't understand, born not of fantasy, but of deep knowledge and respect for the natural world. My own fear was a cold knot in my stomach. What if I was wrong? What if the infection was too aggressive? What if my knowledge wasn't enough? I pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the tasks at hand, on the ancient wisdom passed down through generations of people who had to survive without pharmacies on every corner. Mark sat by the sofa the entire time, holding his son's hand, whispering stories to him, his voice thick with unshed tears. He looked over at me once, his eyes full of a question he was too afraid to ask. I just met his gaze and gave a small, firm nod, a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I will not let him go. The darkest hour was just before dawn. Leo's fever spiked, and his small body was shaken by convulsions. Chloe let out a strangled sob, and my father had to lead her from the room. My mother gripped my arm, her knuckles white. "Is this it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are we losing him?" "No," I said, with a certainty I did not feel. "His body is fighting. This is the crisis. We just have to get him through it." We worked frantically, applying more cool cloths, trying to get more of the willow bark tea into his system. It felt like we were in a tug of war with death itself, pulling on the fragile rope of a child's life. And then, as the first pale, gray light of dawn filtered through the edges of the blackout curtains, it happened. The convulsions stopped. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened into a more regular rhythm. I placed my hand on his forehead. It was still hot, but the raging, infernal heat had lessened. He was damp with sweat. The fever was breaking. A wave of relief, so profound it was physically painful, washed over me. I sagged against the back of the sofa, my own body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. My mother began to weep, not with fear this time, but with gut-wrenching relief. Mark, who had been frozen in terror, touched his son's cheek and then looked at me, his face a canvas of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. Leo was going to be okay. He was weak, exhausted, but he was out of danger. I had done it. My weird hobbies, my paranoid preparations, my hocus-pocus herbs, they had saved his life. In the quiet aftermath, as Leo slept a true, healing sleep for the first time in 36 hours, the atmosphere in the house shifted permanently. The last walls of their resistance, their pride, their old-world identities, had crumbled to dust. Chloe came back into the room, her eyes red and swollen. She walked over to me, and without a word, she wrapped her arms around me, hugging me with a strength I didn't know she possessed. She sobbed into my shoulder, not with the performative drama I was used to, but with raw, unvarnished gratitude. "Thank you," she choked out. "Oh God, Willow, thank you." I held her, patting her back awkwardly. It was the first time we had hugged like that since we were children. Later, my father came and sat beside me at the kitchen table. He was a man who rarely showed emotion, who built walls of logic around his heart. But now those walls were gone. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, and his own shoulders shook slightly. I have never been so proud of you, Willow," he said, his voice thick. "And I have never been so ashamed of myself. For all those years, we didn't see you. We didn't see who you were. We just saw what you weren't. We were fools." He looked me in the eye, and I saw tears glistening there. "Thank you for saving my grandson. We would be lost without you." It was everything I had ever wanted to hear from him. But in that moment, I realized something profound. The vindication wasn't the sweet, triumphant victory I had imagined. It was a quiet, solemn, and heavy thing. It was earned not with an "I told you so," but with competence, with compassion, with the life of a child. And as I looked at my father, I didn't feel smug. I just felt tired. And finally, I felt seen. A few days after Leo's recovery, I found Mark sitting on the back porch, staring out at the rain-soaked garden. He was whittling a piece of wood with a small knife, a skill I had taught him to pass the time. His movements were slow and thoughtful. He looked up as I approached. "I owe you an apology," he said, not meeting my eyes, just focusing on the piece of wood in his hands. "More than one. I've been a condescending jerk to you for your entire life." I sat down in the chair next to him. "Yes, you have." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "No argument there. I built my whole identity on a house of cards, Willow. The stock market, quarterly earnings, net worth, it was all just numbers on a screen. A fantasy. I thought I was a master of the universe. Then the screen went blank, and I realized I didn't know how to do anything. Not one single thing that actually matters." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a shame that was deep and real. "I mocked you for preparing for a world I refused to believe could exist. And then it existed. And you were the only one ready. You don't just know how to survive, Willow. You know how to live. I'm sorry. For everything." I nodded, accepting the words. They were real and they mattered. Apology accepted, Mark. But the world has changed. We all have to change with it. That conversation was a turning point. It was as if the fever had broken not just in Leo, but in the entire family. The dynamic was no longer me versus them. It was just us. They stopped being burdens and started becoming a team. Their learning accelerated, driven now by a genuine desire to contribute, not just a fear of my rules. Mark, with his analytical mind, became my second in command for logistics. He took over the inventory of the pantry and root cellar, creating a detailed system on the whiteboard for rationing and resource management that was actually, to my surprise, more efficient than my own. He applied his spreadsheet brain to something real, and he excelled at it. Chloe, having faced the near loss of her son, found a new and profound respect for the things that sustained life. She became the passionate, dedicated guardian of the garden and the chickens. She learned the rhythms of planting and harvesting, the signs of disease in the flock. She found a peace in the dirt that her curated life had never given her. Her hands were permanently stained with soil now, and she wore it like a badge of honor. My father, the engineer, became the house's handyman. He was fascinated by my solar power system, and together we worked to optimize it, increasing its efficiency in small but significant ways. He repaired tools, reinforced the chicken coop against predators, and designed a brilliant, complex new rainwater collection and filtration system that far surpassed my original setup. He was building, creating with his hands, and it brought a light back to his eyes I hadn't seen in years. My mother found her domain in the kitchen, becoming the master of preservation. She and I spent long afternoons canning the last of the autumn harvest, our hands moving in sync, the quiet rhythm of our work a form of communication. She was no longer fluttering with anxiety. She was focused and capable, the quiet heart of our household. We had become a unit, a clan. We worked together, ate together, and in the evenings we sat by the fire and talked. Not about the stock market or social media, but about the day's work, the state of the garden, the plan for the next day. We were a family in a way we had never been before. Months passed. The vibrant colors of autumn gave way to the stark, gray palette of winter. The world outside our fence remained a dangerous and uncertain place. We heard stories on the shortwave radio of fledgling governments forming in other regions, of struggles for control, of widespread famine and disease. But inside our little fortress, we were secure. We had warmth, light, food, water, and most importantly, we had each other. One evening, we were all gathered around the dinner table, eating a stew made from our own potatoes, carrots, and a tough old rooster that had stopped being useful. It was simple food, but it was delicious because every ingredient represented our own labor. My father raised his glass of filtered water. "A toast," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "to the captain of our lifeboat." They all raised their glasses to me. Mark, Chloe, my mother. Their faces, illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamps, were filled with a love and respect that was so genuine it almost brought tears to my eyes. I looked at them, my family, these people who had been transformed by disaster. Mark, the arrogant banker, was now a skilled woodsman and logistician. Chloe, the shallow influencer, was now a nurturing gardener. My father, the dismissive intellectual, was now a practical builder. My mother, the anxious hostess, was now a calm and capable preserver. And me, I was no longer Willow the weirdo, the paranoid outcast. I was their leader, their teacher, their protector. In that moment, I realized the truth. I had spent years preparing to survive the end of the world alone. But I had been wrong. The ultimate prep, the most critical resource, wasn't the food or the water or the solar panels. It was them. It was a family that could work together, trust each other, and rely on each other's strengths. The disaster hadn't just proven me right. It had given me the one thing I never knew I was preparing for: a real family. The lights were still out in the rest of the world, but in our small home, a new kind of light was burning brighter than ever before. Looking back on it all now, it's funny how a single cataclysmic event can burn away everything that's fake and leave only the truth behind. For years, I thought my family's approval was something I needed, a validation I craved. But when the world fell apart, I learned that my worth wasn't something they could grant or withhold. It was something I had built with my own two hands, in the soil of my garden, in the shelves of my cellar, in the knowledge I had so painstakingly acquired. The solar flare didn't give me my power. It just created the circumstances where everyone else was finally forced to see it. True security, I've learned, isn't found in a system you trust or a society that promises to keep you safe. It's in what you know, what you can do, and who stands beside you when everything else has fallen to pieces. I'm curious to hear your own stories. Have you ever had a skill or a passion that others dismissed, only to find it become essential later on? Share your experience in the comments below. It's in sharing these stories that we build a stronger community and learn from one another. And as always, if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and change, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. I hope it gives you strength. Remember to value what is real and to cultivate your own preparedness, whatever that may look like for you. Thank you for joining me.